we might be ready to start. Can people hear me okay? Okay, thank you, Divya, for your masterful tech problem shooting business, and thank you everyone also for hanging in there during this Mercury retrograde. And thank you for joining us on this discussion on the occasion of Cosmic Mothers, which is closing actually on the 22nd of January. So our wonderful panelists tonight are Annie Go and Bonnie Camplin, two artists who are in the show. And we also have via Zoom Mihaela Brebenel, who is a researcher, curator and academic. And happily, we're also joined by Daria, who is the founder of Mimosa House and the curator of the show. So, more astrology. Uranus went direct yesterday, and today the sun is entering Aquarius tonight. It seems that this discussion is well supported, since both may highlight themes of conformity, shaking things up, futurity, space travel, innovation, technology, and air. I wanted to read a tiny bit from Emily Labarge's Art Forum review of the show before inviting Daria to say a bit more about it. Emily said, "Why don't more contemporary exhibitions ask questions about the meaning of existence? I mean it. There is, of course, no meaning, but the visionary fortunes and futures we might hazard are many, which is to say the meaning is what we make, and the world we live in is part of this too, made by us too. If we don't accept what we've been given, told, circumscribed by, can we think and make our way out? Can we turn state structures and beliefs on their heads to generate some brave new alterity with infinite horizons, first ideological, and then someday practical, real?" And then Emily quotes Ursula Le Guin. "Some dreams tell us what we wish to believe. Some dreams tell us what we fear. Some dreams are what we know what we know, though we may not know we knew it. The rarest dream is the dream that tells us what we did not know." So Daria, thanks for making this wonderful exhibition. Would you like to introduce the show for us?
Hello everyone, and thank you for coming to this event and to see the show as well. So this is actually our first panel discussion as part of the exhibition, which is really great because I feel like it's such a great way to, kind of to close, to finalize the exhibition. So the whole exhibition, so the concept originated from the Cosmic Mother. So it's an artwork from 1970. So originating from the Soviet Union, made by a Soviet painter, and some of you might have seen it at the back of the space. It's projected there on the wall, and it's an image of a mother and a child, or a carer and a child, floating in the outer space, wearing astronaut suits. So, and this image became really the starting point for thinking about some subjects and themes, such as how knowledge is produced, how ideology and propaganda work, because obviously the context for the creation of this work is communism, behind the Iron Curtain, space race, colonization made by Soviet Union onto other countries around. In fact, there is another artist which belonged to a similar context, is Yanina Kraupesvederska, whose works you can see at the back there. It's a series of paintings and drawings starting from the 40s until Yanina's death in 2016. So Yanina was an astrologer, a professor in an art school, and a medium, so she combined all these kind of incompatible roles in a way, and all of that in the context of Poland under Soviet control. Today we would call her works spiritual abstraction, probably, but they had, she was doing them in a meditative state, and which was especially peculiar when you think about prohibition of religion, and kind of it sends us back to the Cosmic Mother image, which is kind of a suggestion to replace religion with technology and science, and prohibit religion whatsoever. And then I'll just mention one more artist who is not in the panel, is Karuti, whose work is upstairs. Jackie is based in Nairobi, so unfortunately they couldn't join us for the install or for like any of the panel discussions. And so Jackie's work deals with, again, with production of knowledge. Jackie believes that everyone has right to create their own curriculum rather than following like an established one. So they draw their inspiration from Afrofuturism, and kind of the suggestion in the work there is to look into the oceans and like inside the earth rather than in the outer space, because there are so many histories that are forgotten there. So I guess that's it. I'm just gonna leave artists to talk about their works. And yeah, thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you so
and
much.
thank you, Sarah, for moderating.
Thank you. I'm sure that we'll be exploring some of the themes that come up there. And since technically we are watched over by the Cosmic Mother, although we can't see her, I thought I might begin with a question about perspective. So I was thinking about events and images such as the Copernican shift and also the blue marble image, which was taken by the astronauts on board, I think it was Apollo 17 in 1972 on the way to the moon. And it was the picture of the Earth, the whole Earth, that really fed into the environmental movement. And so I was curious about how across your practices you might engage with human subjectivity and an ecological or cosmic consciousness. And I thought that I might start by inviting Miha to come in.
Hi everyone, nice to see you. Hope you can hear me okay. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for this question and for opening up with this image as well. And I guess this is an image that's been like pulled up a lot recently and has opened up these questions for me personally in my work. I'm recently looking at a project around socialist herbalism, and specifically socialist from the Eastern European area. So that type of, because I am Romanian, so I've been looking at practices with herbs. And for me, what this has brought up was the question of learning from being in relation and thinking about how I forgot about that for a while, in learning in this like more formal ways of learning in education, I guess, where, and especially by coming here and being part of a system of education, the UK system of education, and going through that all the way, and then learning in that sense, like practices with plants have reminded me, I guess, about what does it mean even to learn, to question or to really look into with myself, what does it mean to learn by being in relation, rather, let's say, that this journey of learning by systematic knowledge that is produced in educational institutions, let's say, to which my my autistic mind was very happy to incorporate, because systems, yay, knowledge categorized in things is great. Let's get more of that. But that also ached in the body, and in the body mind, and in the body soul mind, and made me think about what learning from being in relation can bring up. And it can be about power, it can be about being in a power relation. For me as a white person, that was one of the things that I've had to to journey into learning, when does that reproduction of like white colonial positionality of learning comes into play? Again, especially after being through and going through and assimilating through a system of learning, and the violence produced by that system of learning onto and the reproduction of that violence of a system of learning onto other bodies. And then thinking about learning from being in relation where the relationship is a painful one. So thinking about trauma, ableism, neurotypical types of learning, and cis heteronormative way of learning and being. So not to make another binary power pain, I was reflecting about how learning with has been something that a lot of people talk about, being with, learning with. We've seen that there are multiple historical ways of relating to that, including the images you brought up, Sarah. But then there's also the most recent, I mean, I sit here with COVID, so learning with the contemporary learning with that we've kind of been talking about, have been doing for the past 2 years or so. So yeah, these are the things, the kind of reflections about learning, and how to, my question is also around planned practices, which also has been a topic very you know, a lot of people have moved towards incorporating these types of knowledges into academia again. So I don't know how I exactly feel about that either. But I guess the thought or the question that sits for me still is how to learn to be in healing relationship with this kind of skewed sense of perspective that both the power, learning in a power relation, and the learning in a painful relation. Because I think in a power relation, there's a fixed axis viewing, you know, like you don't really have to move because you don't need to, you're comfortable. Whereas in a painful learning relationship, I often talk with a dear close friend of mine, Daria, about how trauma is time traveling, and a lot of people talk about that as well. Its explosion, its multitude, is cosmology, constellations constantly shifting and shaping. So yeah, I've been thinking in regards to your question about how we could possibly be through, particularly in my research, through planned practices that are to do with herbal medicine, with the knowledges that I draw from ancestrally, from the socialist, from that area historically, but also the pagan practices that have existed in that geographical area before socialist period, on maybe how to be in healing relationship with this skewed sense of perspective.
Thank you. I mean, there's clearly so many correspondences in all of your work, and there is maybe thinking about picking up on the thread between unlearning, the relationship between unlearning and healing. Would you like to speak about that?
Yeah, I was just thinking, can you hear me okay? Thanks for that, Mihaela. I was just thinking as you were speaking you know, as someone who also works in education, and yeah, the depths of the unlearning that we often have to undo, that are systemic oppressions, or we can't undo them all at once, but we have to kind of be in that constant relationship of unlearning and undoing. And because you brought up the Copernican revolution, and I was thinking of, there's a Sylvia Wynter essay which she starts by kind of citing in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and kind of traces the transformation of the notion of human through kind of these different stages that she calls man 1 and man 2, through kind of, you know, Western civilization, and one of those is around the kind of the Copernican shift, and there's just, so I think that just kind of puts into perspective so many of the systems of knowledge that many of us in our practices and in our whatever those practices are trying to undo. And you know, for Winter, and for I think many of us who agree with her thinking and her feminism, it is about reclaiming humanity from people for whom that humanity has been taken and stolen. And yeah, I guess redefining notions of human, and the politics of knowledge production, which is something that I am very interested in kind of all facets of my being as an artist and as a researcher, and also as a teacher, as a lecturer, in a really granular level, you know, from kind of taking part in trade union politics and strikes to the very kind of type of pedagogy that I undertake in the classroom, and then in the context of like this exhibition, I suppose through my art practice and my research, and I think maybe in responding kind of with my practice to this point, I am thinking of so I presume you've all kind of seen the exhibition. So I have a 3-part sound installation in this exhibition, and the one piece in the upstairs back room, Cyber Ketal, is a recreation, a resynthesis of the chirp of this echo, which I've never myself heard, but if you go to the Chichen Itza pyramid in Mexico and clap, it will make a sound similar to that. And in investigating, so I've researched this field of acoustic archaeology, and it's kind of from this research that the 3 works that I presented as part of this exhibition came about. And I guess what I'm interested in recreating and resynthesizing this echo chirp is what those systems of knowledge, how different those systems of knowledge might have been at the time that those pyramids were created. And I guess thinking about, you know, our contemporary understanding as a kind of cage. You know, acousticians can very clearly explain using equations and diagrams and formulas like how that chirp occurs from a clap and reflection of the stairs of the pyramid going up and reflecting back. And that's one understanding that we have of echoes. This very kind of dry, rational, masculinist, patriarchal, white, scientific, kind of hard set of knowledges, which obviously have many uses in a much bigger context. But what that chart echo meant, or the multiple meanings of that echo for the people at the time when the pyramids were built. Like that has to be, how can we uncage our thinking about that? And I think that's where we have to really look at our ideas of subjectivity and also our notions of the human, because I think that those echoes, may well have been kind of, more than human beings, or definitely this idea of this generation of sound not just being kind of reflections of matter that kind of reach our ears, but they definitely were something much more than that. Seeing as the Quetzal bird is very important in Mayan and Aztec mythology, and so acoustic archaeologists have a big, discussion about whether that was intentional, whether this was a design, that this chirp echo comes back, or whether it was accidental, and then afterwards they decided to devote the pyramids to the birds and the snakes. And it's kind of like those debates are not actually that interesting, and we get caught up in them because of the systems of knowledge that exist. So I guess I would respond to this kind of set of thoughts by hopefully inviting people to listen to that sound with that extra kind of imagination of that echo is not just a cold kind of reflection of matter, of sonic matter. It has loads of other possible meanings.
Thank you so much. I think the way that science and certain knowledge practices have come up so far have really reminded me of the work of Anna Singh, for whom stories are a kind of science. And she said to me, actually when we were talking about the blue marble, that now the challenge is to see both at the same time, to see the planet and the multitude of places that have greatly varied kinds of environmental, socio-political relations and histories embedded in them, and to learn kinds of storytelling that allow us to acknowledge both at the same time. So thinking about this way of holding oneness and multiplicity together, I was kind of wondering if we could turn to you, Bonnie, and ask about your work with esotericism, and your engagement with science and knowledge system, and indeed how one might come to know.
Another word for unlearning is deprogramming, and syntax is key. Understanding syntax is key. Listening to how do I lock eyes? I was really enjoying your syntax, and it's a very precise and new syntax that I'm hearing, and I think it's necessary to formulate new syntactical ways through knowledge. Poetry is the original hack, right? And I think one problem with scientism is it doesn't really understand itself as a belief system. It thinks it has total access to total knowledge, and that's the folly of many scientists, is that they haven't studied syntax, and they haven't studied the madness of their own syntax and the limitations of it. Korzybski wrote to this, I think in the 40s. He set up the General Institute of Semantics, and he wrote a text called Science and Sanity, where he said, if science was truly scientific, then it would have to ultimately become situational and poetic, because to become ultra specific would have to take its own logic to the sort of infinite, and so you may as well just be develop your situational acuity. Am I making sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Great sense. I'm writing it all down. Poetry is the original hack.
The pathologization of language has also been a key part of the strategy for securing the Weltanschauung. So, it used to be kind of, women were kind of locked up in psychiatric wards for spelling and speaking their spells, because it was understood that spelling is powerful, and indeed, scientific process is spelling. It is actually a ritual that narrows reality down in a very specific way and produces very limited sort of bandwidths of access to a particular level of reality. But I actually had an article which I've lost, which was about the pathologization of the language of gypsies as strategy for securing the Weltanschauung. So shutting down people's way of speaking, dismissing it and marginalizing it and pathologizing it. And it's happened to a lot of, even 10 years ago where I teach, when I first started teaching there, if you used the word channeling, you were laughed out the room. I wasn't, because I was the teacher and but we sort of re-invoked the word channeling, and now it's understood to be a methodology for knowledge access. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how some witches and people accused of being magicians or fraudulent magicians, where they couldn't figure out what to try these people on, so they were actually tried under the Vagrancy Act. And so this wandering, this roaming around without being in a fixed abode and paying your taxes or whatever was very threatening to a certain kind of worldview. And I was also thinking whilst you were speaking about Lynn Margulis and how she as a scientist was so adamant that science always had to keep evolving, and the point at which it thinks it knows what it's doing is not science anymore. And I don't know if you've seen clips of her debating Richard Dawkins, but they're so life-giving, they're wonderful. So yeah, I mean, speaking of Margulis, we are sitting here in the midst of a pandemic, and we are definitely in the symbiotic soup. And this exhibition as a whole speaks to this queer universe and moves across a speculative genealogy of contamination and invention. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about your work in relation to such approaches. How do you approach complexity? And Bonnie, we're sitting here nested among your kind of para-scientific diagrams, which also, there's an overlap with, say, some mystical symbols as well. Could you speak more about that?
Can you narrow it down a touch for me?
Sure.
My mind.
Well, it's a question about complexity, because this wild profusion of existing things, to use Foucault's phrase. Why do you use diagrams in your work, for example? What is your process? Is it iterative?
Yes. These drawings were made 2 years ago, over 3 years ago, and they're actually a culmination of a life's work. They're probably the most focused I've ever been, and the most didactic. They are, they're didactic. They're like, and this is how reality works. So it's, I think somebody mentioned earlier about hyper-systematizing, about being a bit autistic and being hyper-systematizing. So yeah, now I'm going to drift off into feminine or sort of autism, thinking about how the orthodoxy was that autism was a male trait, and it turned out that it wasn't. It was just they didn't really get how feminine autism works. It's just more 5D. We systematize, in 5D instead of linear. But complexity. Well, I've spent quite a few years trying to understand what spirals have to do with being, and so this is me spelling it out to myself about how reality is. I am trying to sort of speak to complexity. It's not a word I use that often. It's a holographic universe, and you can open new domains of knowing by sort of experimenting with syntax and diagrams. Yeah, you can literally kind of diagram through and sort of enter into reality dimensionally through diagrams.
I love that so much. I was not reading the whole book because I don't do that, but looking at a bit of a book by David Bohm. And looking at the section about the lens and the hologram, and this kind of leads me back into thinking about our tool sets and the DSM, for example, by which you might diagnose autism being from a particular circumscription of a set of symptoms or appearances. What is made legible by the system of legibility that we're in, which is very, I think, what you're talking about, Sylvia Winter's work. So I was also thinking that maybe we could ask you about your working with sonic cyberfeminisms here.
I guess, yeah, so sonic cyberfeminisms is a kind of ongoing project and concept that I work with a collective of people, and in particular my one collaborator and good comrade, Marie Thompson. But it's nothing more really than just kind of a set of words and terms that helps us, or a lens almost, that helps us decrypt and scrutinize various things and the conjunction of sound, gender and technology. And I guess with this exhibition it was the first time that I kind of applied it in creating new works. And funnily that you say that complexity isn't a word that you use that often, because I feel like it's a word that I overuse in a way that is kind of generic and flattening, because it's just quite an easy go-to of like, oh, it's complex, isn't it? So I feel like I overuse it, and in my kind of artistic process, each of the works that I presented here, for example, is an attempt at kind of, I guess, distilling something complex down into another form. So the drone piece that plays here on the ground floor, that I was really delighted to kind of make for this space, and knowing that Bonnie's works were going to be in this first part of the gallery, and the Yanina's work was going to be in the back part, and the kind of content of it, the myth of this 111 hertz that has taken off as a phenomenon. There's thousands of YouTube videos of this kind of supposedly kind of healing frequency, and in some ways that's about the complexity of that phenomenon, because that phenomenon actually has, one of its roots into it is from archaeoacoustics and theories of chambered mounds that resonate around this frequency that are thought to have healing properties, and that kind of like took off in this internet phenomenon way that things do. And it's kind of, you know, my position is really that I don't care whether it's true or not, and like trying to deny like that kind of, I guess, truth, non-truth binary of like, is this a healing frequency or not? It's not really what I'm interested in, but I am interested in kind of somehow addressing this like phenomenon in its complexity, and then I guess it's almost an experiment in the sonic affect of what happens when we do submerge ourselves in this frequency, which I really enjoyed doing when making the piece. Yeah, maybe it is healing, but I kind of, I leave that question open. So I think that's, it's for me, complexity is quite a good get out of getting out of a lot of those, I guess, dualisms and binaries. But I don't know if that's a good thing.
Symbiotic soup. Miha, feel free to join us and jump in anytime. Would you like to respond to this healing myth? Myth science. I believe in 111, but
yeah, like on the phone when you have the clock on the thing. No, I really enjoyed your work about that, Annie, because I saw the exhibition at some point before, and I really enjoyed the way that is taken up there and how it's being, like, the immersiveness of how you put it into, you installed it here in the exhibition as well, the fact that it kind of resonates in the whole space. What I was, I love all of the connections. I had a lot of memes in my head as well, because that is the nature of the syntax of my mind recently, and I think that should also be kind of acknowledged, and it has shifted and changed a lot of how I personally, but I feel that I just allowed contamination, if you will, which is perfect, but it's also, as we know, very kind of bubbled up. And I love that at the moment, that this is the kind of processing that goes on through these the multitude of forms of information receiving and composting and circulation. But I wanted to maybe share that I've been thinking a lot in terms of your question, Sarah. So there was the question, I've been thinking about inflammation a lot, and that's very particular to just the need of learning about it for myself initially through chronic illness connected to inflammation, which is such a puzzle, such a weird thing that you can never stop learning about, because again, it's a system of things and there's so many points of it that could trigger something, and then you just go down the rabbit hole basically. But I wanted to say that I have a few friends who are doing this reading group on this book called Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. And I think that is a great book because it also connects with very current, it came out last year or this year, and not this year, last year. So thinking through something like inflammation and immune systems, and thinking on how, thinking about receptors and amino acids and a whole system of medicine and medicinal knowledge that comes from science structures, but then kind of messing it up a lot and not questioning it, but also messing it up a lot, and also trying to think not just in terms of translating and transmuting these at language level or at symbolic level as metaphors, but also at practice levels. For me, it's been in terms of personally of trying to look at, for example, how this whole area of medicine that is endocrinology, which treats hormones, which are connected to both trauma, like cortisol and adrenaline, which are these like major inflammation-producing hormones, and connected to PTSD, connected to anxiety, to depression, but then also how they could be supportive in like sex hormones, and not to produce HRT, like not to actually go through transition, but to think about how already the system of knowledge that speaks about sex hormones and endocrinology is based on this very binary heteronormative organization of knowledge about these hormones. So that system itself is fascinatingly gone through a level of visualization of receptors of for example, modeling, visualizing and modeling of molecular biology has gone to a level of detail that nobody actually, I think it's just a bit harder to question the data sets now that they've been so stultified with this type of knowledge production. So I think like inflaming also can be like, how can we put some inflammation in these types of databases? You know, how can we deal with the inflammation of our systems, but also how is it possible to you know, fuck it up a little, create some inflammation of those systems as well.
I love that. I was just thinking about a podcast I was listening to about TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, and the practitioner was saying that in TCM, the one true pathology is not letting things flow. And what you're saying is actually something that's more disruptive, going against that. Did you want to respond, Bonnie or Annie?
Can I speak to just the whole notion of disease and how disease has been framed and understood over the last 100 years, and how that has been used for the very purpose of social control? And it's very controversial, but the germ theory I've come to realise was just a theory, and it's actually been refuted soundly and roundly by the terrain model of disease, that says the body does not have an immune system, rather it's a filtration system, and that all disease is simply detoxing. And so what's the nature of the toxins? The toxins are your inner terrain and your external terrain, and the external terrain includes EMF pollution. So it makes sense when you think of the information field rather than you know, particles flying out of noses and mouths, but rather signatures and energy forms which are sort of flow around in the information field. So you can have toxic, you know, toxic thought forms. So it's a bit more morphic, a bit more morphogenesis than things, you know. So the bioweapon that is part of this multi-vector, multi-platform poisoning, mass poisoning that's happening, it's radiation. It's a form of it's a combination of radiation poisoning and epigenetics. So DNA is a harmonic resonator. So you speak of the endocrine system, it's the nervous system, and I could give a whole lecture on how all this kind of has been happening over the last 2 years. I could do the science on it, but it's become quite political. So the sort of the people who are kind of all about natural law and freedom and common law, they're all into the terrain theory, and they see how the germ theory of each of us being a biohazardous threat to each other is actually a form of programming that has been around for 100 years and is actually pseudoscience. Virology is pseudoscience. So it's controversial, but it does speak to your inflammation thing, which is inflammation is simply one stage of the detox process. I don't know whether you feel like that's a good thing, a welcome thing, or does it?
I was not aware of this, so I'm gonna have to look into it a bit.
Antoine Béchamp, it's the Battle of the White Males. Antoine Béchamp was brought the terrain theory, and Louis Pasteur was a useful idiot actually for the control system. So it's worth looking into. But I'd like to hear a bit more about your inflammation as a sort of. Could you speak more to this inflammation concept?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Unless Annie, did you wanna add something?
I mean, I can freely associate some stuff, which I'd quite like to do. Just thinking, I mean, I'm not hugely knowledgeable about botany, but I think as you were speaking, well, both of you actually, I was thinking about the kind of, in relation to this idea of knowledge systems, the kind of ever shrinking down or ever cordoning off of sanctified knowledges and kind of unruly knowledges, and this article or book I read, he's by an author whose name I unfortunately can't remember anymore, but it was about the kind of history of the specific type of plant that can cause abortions, induce abortions, abortifacients, and how these were, the knowledge around these and the practice of using these was stamped out by European colonialists in both literally kind of eradicating their existence, but also eradicating the knowledge around that women shared in order to be able to control pregnancy and birth, and just how kind of relevant that is in a contemporary context when we see in the US Roe versus Wade is probably going to be reversed. We're living in this really truly crazy time of this pandemic, and things just always seem to get more and more apocalyptic as the months pass. And I guess this idea of inflammation as potential resistance was where I was thinking, this is where I guess grassroots practices or community practices, knowledge sharing around such things as these plants might start re-emerging in new ways, given the kind of times that we live in. So that's what I was thinking about.
Thank you, Miha. Feel free to also not have to say anything if you don't want to.
So Annie, that's one side for sure of I guess something that I've noticed as well, and it has obviously been happening with all of these directories of plant medicine around COVID, from different, from world traditions being put into, accumulated in these community actions. And of course, there's like actions like Herbalists Without Borders, who do a lot of work at Calais as well, using plant medicine to treat people there, and so there is this like connection, I guess, and like efforts that are emerging for community care, I guess, with plants and healing as well in different, and that's not void of politics, because, for example, in the States there was a large lawsuit where a company was trying to patent fire cider, which is this apple cider vinegar with a lot of ginger, garlic compounds that is known to have like immune boosting properties. So the fact that there was a corporate interest towards essentially medicine that's been around for and should be readily available for everybody is also a sign that these actions at smaller or like community level actions and the revival of, or not revival, but like people being drawn into these practices individually or communally has also, it's creating some resistance and some reverberation. I guess in that sense, I'm making the argument that you know that once there is interest from like corporate or governmental and so forth, there is something there, you know, in that. But I was also speaking quite, I guess, on one sense, metaphorically and still symbolically, as a kind of speculative practice, as I was going into this very new terrain and basically going into a rabbit hole of knowledge that is not my field at all, and I'm not trained into being this of generally medicine, but also this specific area as it is endocrinology, as it is like labeled and organized into medicine, and then into molecular biology and trying to look at how has this been coded, because that's like not something that for various reasons I felt I could access as information, or I don't know. And where it is now from when, you know, I was taught chemistry in the 6th grade or something, and ending up looking at these extremely detailed visualizations that have these software systems that make a lot of money, and that on the production of these visualizations are sitting on data sets that were created in specific visualizing technology and imaging technologies. It's called crystallographic. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but thinking about that, I was, or arriving there to what this kind of scientific visualizing is doing right now in like molecular biology, essentially, made me wonder about the data set, you know, like a very basic question. Like, okay, so this is happening and people are taking this data set, but what is the data set? How was the data set created? What kind of ways of understanding this abstraction, what kind of abstraction processes were put in, and what are the kind of locked-in biases and locked-in powers, as we know happens a lot with this kind of scientific knowledges, and then how does that like eventually affect real life applications of this molecular biological model, say in when you go to the, you know, as a trans person, you try to access hormone replacement therapy. You're basically linked and connected to this type of knowledge. You are seen there as a subject walking in that's going to be applied this type of scientific knowledge onto. So that was where I was thinking, and then the speculation was, can we produce some information in the data set, basically.
I'm not sure if Miha's still with us or if.
Okay.
Oh, you are. Okay, great. Thank you. So I want to open to questions soon, so I'll try and kind of bring things together, although it's been very sprawling, but maybe just to stay on the kind of medical metaphor, I was thinking that the inflammation plus inflammation is kind of a bit like, you know, the pharmacon principle of the poison being the cure, and the not binary oppositions, but certainly kind of different approaches of allopathy and homeopathy. Allopathy tending to be what westernized medical systems usually utilize, and that's, you know, simply kind of treating hot with cold, for example. Whereas, say, medical traditions, such as those that follow the poison path, are actually also about finding a sense of the sacred, or that the sacred is necessary as part of a healing. So I wanted to bring my final questions to this kind of threading of devotion or belief throughout the entire show, because the Cosmic Mother is obviously, the iconography is very much like a Madonna and Child. And so a broad question to all of you about the role of devotion and belief, but also specifically I was wondering that since there is the Cosmic Mother, there is also the Cosmic Child. And where might the figure of the child be in these speculative genealogies in this show and beyond for you? What is the child for you in relation to creativity and survival? And what practices of attunement might there be to the potentiality of the child? Annie?
Yeah, so I guess I have been thinking a lot about motherhood because I'm pregnant. And I was reading, as I was conceiving the works for this exhibition, before I was pregnant actually, Sophie Lewis's book Full Surrogacy Now, and they also recently published a couple of articles on kind of motherhood and mothering, and they make this distinction between motherhood as a kind of institution and mothering as an act, and kind of opening up these questions of care, relations of care, that are also found in surrogacy. You know, surrogacy is this like hugely complex and financialized, marketized practice that, you know, the book deals with, but it wants to kind of open up these relations of care. You know, the subtitle is Feminism Against the Family. And I think that gets misconstrued a lot, because what you know they're arguing for is kind of a proliferation and abundance of relations of care, of love, and kind of an invitation for that to be going in all directions. So I think, haven't thought so much about this in relation to the notion of the child, but I guess it's, you know, it's there in the Cosmic Mother painting, and in the kind of relations of care that are represented there. I think there's so much that needs to be undone. Like there's so much in my work. The audio piece upstairs with the mirror. There was so much that I was trying to unpack and interrogate about the seemingly inherent conservatism around motherhood and parenting and childhood that is kind of so deeply rooted. And when, you know, if you're pregnant and you're going through this process, you're just like, oh my god, like it's so heteronormative, and it's so you know, it's mind-blowing the way that these things have been left, you know, undisturbed in the model of the nuclear family, that really, you know, these things really do need disturbing and exploding in ways that I personally haven't figured out yet how to do. But I think Sophie Lewis's work is really important and interesting to me, because it invites us to re-examine and reconceive of a lot of these relations of care, also around parenthood, mothering, parenting.
I was also thinking about the womb, the archaeological wombs in your work upstairs. But maybe I might turn to Miha now and invite you to join the conversation if you'd like to.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Annie, for bringing Sophie to the small, and also for sharing. I was thinking about Revolutionary Mothering by Alexis Pollingams as one kind of anchor around this question, and also about these like questions of the cis, of course, the cishet and nuclear, like questions about family, which obviously are with queer and trans experience very they're very much lived on a very granular level with each point of this of any setup that involves family making, right? So presence of what this notion of a child or a mother or parent or become really complicated in relation to the state, and are being complicated because of these because of the systems, and it's not just symbolic, it's very, very real in relation to state and what the state defines. Like for here, there's like, for example, in the UK, there's like one parent, like that the mother, the birthing parent, that gets automatically assigned as the parent of a child. Just one example, if you decide to have constellations of co-parenting, parental care leave, for example, or offering care, structures of care in other forms than a very strict heteronormative family making are structurally harder. So they would impose so much more effort and leave people often so much more tired, as if bringing a person into this world was not enough, tiring enough. But I've been thinking personally a lot around the figure of the child as for me in relation to trauma, for example. We talk about there's been a lot of conversation about reparenting that comes up around these types of self-parenting or reparenting yourself. And I've been thinking about a lot about like rechilding and collective rechilding as well. That's done in constellation with others and in community. So I think the figure of the parent is more complex than like a fresh human being. The figure of the child is much more complex than that of a fresh human being, a freshly fleshed human being. In relation to the painting in the exhibition, I feel it does open up a lot of historical and contemporary issues around reproductive justice and Poland, for example, currently, but also in Romania, where I'm from, and that is also tied with this idea of the traditional family. Like in Romania, you have like a coalition that's a political party, coalition for the traditional family. So they, for example, tried to pass, had a referendum to change the constitution to say explicitly, although gay marriage, for example, or same-sex marriage is not is not legally possible in Romania. There was this like conceded effort to re-establish and reground and really formalize the idea symbolically and applied the idea of a traditional family, of a heteronormative nuclear cisgendered family. So that just is a reality, and it's very different from what we experience in the UK at the moment, where there are challenges to, let's say, making up other forms of familial structures and familial kinship structures. But yeah, in relation to the exhibition, I wanted to maybe make that note.
Thank you so much. Money.
Well, I picked up more on the belief part of your question, and my brother Joe's here, Joe
Hey, Joe.
Walsh. He's at the back. But we both were trained in herbal deep observation by a pagan herbalist, and how I came to meet her, Lisa Fannin her name is, I sort of reached out into the cosmos with a very scientific question, which was how did the witches access the knowledge about the plants? And along came the answer in the form of Lisa Fannin's teaching. And so going back again to the implicate order, they would call the explicate order, we learned how to sort of reach into the structure of the plant and listen deeply to the plant with the whole of ourself. And so it beats any microscope, and you can actually kind of get inside and receive information as to the geometry of the plant structure, and and then you suddenly, oh yeah, so that's how they know that this is good for this and this is good for that, and this harmonizes this and complements that, and it's this geometry of information. So yeah, knowledge can be accessed through inventive, asking new kinds of questions that might seem impossible as inscribed in the scientific kind of model, but actually if you ask good questions, you get good answers.
How you would describe
Belief is,
yeah,
you need to believe. Belief is a skill set, is what I'm saying.
kind of like prayer,
Indeed.
and the way that you're talking about kind of having this other kind of access to the molecular reality of the plants made me think of the healer in Octavia Butler's Patternist quartet, who heals, for example, she turns into a dolphin by eating a bit of a dolphin and understanding its molecular structure. And then also speaking of Octavia Butler, what you're saying about asking different kinds of questions makes me think of her epigraph to one of her books that wasn't actually published in the end, but it's "There is nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns," which brings us back to the beginning and Copernicus. So I hope that you've all been formulating lots of amazing questions, because I would like to invite you to ask some now. Do you have any?
like based on the last kind of comments, do you think there's a way that science and like herbalism can mutually inform each other? Because I feel like the way you discuss them, it seems like science could never understand it, but sometimes I think of like science as a really interesting way to like see a different kind of beauty, like especially when you look at like say these microscopic jewelries, it's like, and the like blue marble, like it's so incredible to see beauty like that, and then that could be why someone could understand like the majesty and then go into like the spiritual aspects. So just wondered how those could inform each other rather than being on separate ends.
Should I try and I'll try and maybe capture like a little bit of what you said so that everyone can hear, hopefully, which is, can science and faith or herbalism mutually enforce and inform each other? Is that part of it? And so, for example, you were referencing the awe that one might feel upon seeing the blue marble image. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Miha might be better equipped to answer this. I guess it just made me think about the areas of the research that I undertook for my installation, which were I experienced them more in a conflict, but in this particular project, and I experienced though I experienced in some senses a manipulation of those, like in the way that conspiracy theories often kind of tap into people's insecurities or weaknesses, or so I guess I'm sensitized somewhat to where that can be abused, but I think in general, and yeah, I think there are, I'm sure, many instances where they will mutually reinforce each other. In our co-acoustics and in the research that I undertook, there was often, slightly misleading, almost a kind of overly masculinist approach of kind of, I have these beliefs and I'm gonna use science to prove them to everyone and make sure that like you all like swallow that whole in a forceful way. And I think there's many other better ways of seeing these things as mutually reinforcing one another. But I didn't find that so much in our acoustics. Yeah, but maybe Bonnie or Miha has
I do think there's a reciprocity that can be achieved between actual science rather than scientism. Science being looking at patterns in the data, deep observation, but science does need to learn some humility and understand that it is a particular way of framing reality rather than being the ultimate access to reality. It needs to learn a little bit of humility. That will happen. Well, you know, the best artists are also scientists, the best scientists are also artists, so that reciprocity is, works well also with scientists, etc.
Miha, would you like to join in?
Yeah, thank you both for those answers. I think I'm just going to just read, like maybe just I completely I mean, I agree, and I think with both of your stands, like both of the possibility for a tip of a balance or a tip of like of an imbalance or an abuse or on either side, I guess, and also the kind of humility like lesson. But I was just thinking of an example in a book that I'm sure a lot of people here are aware of, The Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and the idea of the data set which she just like undoes in such a beautiful way and in such a way that reinforces that observation or being with the land has is in itself a valid method of collection of, and it's a valid data set. In this case, writing about indigenous knowledge of a land and of plants and of crops and of cycles and of the moon and of the waters that go through it and of all of the elements that is that is in connection rather than in this kind of separation and violence relation.
Thank you, everyone. I really agree with the whole epistemic humility point, and I think it's not so much about, I don't know, Copernicus or the Blue Marble, but more like what Anna Singh says, which is how to see everything, and not just see, but to listen and to smell things in relation, even when they're not quite commensurate, and even as they're decaying. And I see that we have another question from Benny.
Hi. Thanks everyone for your great talk. I was interested in something Bonnie said at the end about belief being a skill set. That was like really evocative, and it reminded me of something that I came across recently by Lorraine Daston, who talks about how scientific observations become more richly real in their reiterations, and so, you know, I was thinking about kind of science as a belief that is part of a skill set, and I was wondering if you could maybe think about or talk about like what other kinds of beliefs, like I guess skill has something to do with refinement, has something to do with precision potentially, and so how does that precision apply to things outside of science?
Thank you. I'll just repeat it for people at the back. So Benny was thinking about belief being a skill set, drawing on what Bonnie was saying recently. And there's someone called Lorraine Daston who was saying that scientific observation becomes more real with repeated reiterations. So this question is, I think, about belief, but also where else in, say, belief or other forms of skill sets does precision play a role? More or less, I got that. Okay, thank you.
It has to do with survival and the human as a perceiving organism with a sort of mission to learn itself. That sort of situational acuity is something that I feel is a skill set we all do need to learn, and that requires paying attention and a spaciousness, actually, and so it's almost like the opposite of precision, spaciousness. Maybe that's my word for complexity, is spaciousness. It sort of happens by being spacious, and it's like a yogic thing. It's becoming yogic. How be as spacious as possible and as focused as possible, and be able to readily move between those states at any given moment mentally. So mental flexibility. And I think that those, if you sort of understand art making or science or questioning or learning as a sort of bringing together into the same movement love, survival and creativity, then things really start to open up, but they also get really beautifully elegant and precise and satisfying. It's ultra specificity. Does that make sense?
That's really thanks.
Naomi, who would you like to respond?
I was actually thinking a bit on this idea, what you were talking about, Miha, around trauma and how often that is kind of damage done at a particular point, but from that point on, it's kind of, you know, self-perpetuating, and it takes a lot of unlearning, to reference our earlier conversation, to undo a lot of that. And I think that's also where belief or practices, devotional practices, or regular practices of care, well, if we're lucky, we find them and we can access those. And maybe that's one instance where it is possible to obtain kind of a certain amount of precision within those to overcome those destructive tendencies of trauma.
Yeah, I'll say a few words only. I really like this notion of situational acuity. And also, thanks for bringing up maybe like something like ritual, bringing up ritual and I guess ritual versus not versus, but as something more capacious than repetition. I never thought of belief as a skill set. But I do think that there is this a violence in repetition, and as much as there is a violence in appropriation. So if something gets repeated enough, it gets crystallized. It kind of and then appropriation in that sense of belief practices, which is something that we also see a lot of. And personally addressing that of what kind of, where do I go to anchor a ritual into as a white Romanian person who is working through these questions where I'm not making a separation between learning about, say, a plant and its healing properties, like Bonnie was sharing earlier, through a scientific lens only, but I'm trying to experience and be with and be in relation with. And then what kind of relation? Where do I base that relation? Because I think you mentioned, Benny, this idea of belief being a skill set. But then beliefs we know are also have been sedimented, and they're connected to structural formations that can give you power, right? And either you hold that by default because you're part of a category that holds that that is part of that formation, or you insert yourself into it by trying to access a belief. And then that is a form of violently crystallizing something in yourself that is not your own. It just brought up all these images of how measurement, and observation, and all of these procedures of through which science operates are repetitive, and they crystallize something, but it's also very flexible. Like, you can go in, you can enter as much as you can enter into belief systems, but then it becomes a question more of I guess going back to the beginning, for me at least, questioning what kind of relationship am I in with this? What is my relationship? What kind of learning am I doing? From what position?
Thank you. We have a question over here. Yeah.
I really enjoy this talk, and I'm really interested in the experience that Bami said about being in the plant and feel the structure about it. It reminds me of a scientific news that I read about that scientists made another thumb and put it on people's hand, and after like 10 minutes they can totally use it and just feel like they have two thumbs, and it's much more easy to do stuff. I wonder, what do you feel like? Do you feel the way that you feel the plant is some sense that that is physically there, or do you feel more it's a belief, it's a notion? And if it's a notion, then how do you differentiate pseudoscience to science?
That's a brilliant question.
Such a great question. I'm just going to repeat it because it's so good that I don't want people on the Instagram live to miss it. So you were referencing instances where people have been given an extra thumb, and after a short amount of time people really enjoy using these two thumbs, or it's possible to use the extra thumbs. And so the question to Bonnie was, when you're in communion with these plants, how much of it is you? I think that's what you're asking, your belief about your communion with the plants, and so therefore, what is science, what is pseudoscience, what is the nature of reality, maybe, is to make it really big, sorry. But Bonnie, thank you.
Well, the belief thing is has to do with the fact that part of our sort of conditioning, the colonization of everybody, has been to limit the sense of what is possible. And so, I have found it necessary to step outside of what is inscribable according to the norms, the normative, inscribed version of reality, and sort of play with what kinds of questions I can ask about reality. So, for example, rather than saying, is it possible to communicate with a plant, I would ask, how is it possible to communicate with a plant? And I immediately have access to whatever, if that's real and possible, then I immediately have halfway to accessing, that reality. The thing about the actual experience of entering the structure of that plant was as real as it gets. You know when it's real, don't you? I mean, you do know. That's another thing one needs to develop, is one's own trust in oneself. It's all very well saying, oh, I'm intuitive and I trust my intuition. You have to be able to trust your intuition and honour your intuition, not just trust it, you have to honour it as well. So that's probably what I mean by developing the skill set of belief. It's that precision. You have to really know the difference between, is it just my habitual programming, or is it actual access to actual new information? So it's Am I making sense? Yeah. So it is precise, but it's on your own terms, and you have to make the commitment to that level of knowing. So it's a confidence thing as well. It's a thing you can play with, you know, alone. No one has to know. You can just do it internally. But I knew that I had access to the internal structure of the plant. I knew I did, so I can't really argue with that.
I think that everyone might agree with me that these words of wisdom and really invitation might be the best place to end on. So thank you so much, Bonnie. Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Miha. Thank you, Daria. Thank you, Divya. Thank you, Sandra. And thank you to everyone here tonight.
Thank you, everyone.